Have you been thinking about diversifying your property portfolio, but unsure how or where to invest next? SJR Property Group is a buyer's agency based in Perth, specialising in helping East Coast investors diversify their portfolios. We focus on helping our clients achieve their financial goals by investing in high-quality, high-cash-flow investment properties that are poised for long-term capital growth. If you've been thinking of investing in the WA market, the team at SJR have feet on the ground and are here to help. Visit sjrpropertygroup.com.au or call us today on 1300 757 774 to chat with an expert.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello everyone, Grace Ormsby here. It has been a pretty crazy few weeks in the world of property. A lot of things happening, both on the political side of things and when it comes to these policies, which again is part of the government's push. What we are seeing from both a federal and state level, and we thought we needed to unpack it all. So it is an absolute pleasure to be joined by my team, the real estate team here at Momentum Media, Juliet Helmke and Kyle Robbins. Juliet, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here. Kyle,
good to see you in the studio again.
Thanks for having me back.
It has been a pretty crazy couple of weeks. I think we can all attest to that. There's news coming out on the daily from our perspective with very much huge relevance to not only the real estate profession itself, but also to the investors who are trying to work out what this market actually means for them at the moment. Obviously, we're in the middle of winter. To timestamp this, we are at the winter solstice today, the shortest day of the year. So pretty much smack bang in the middle. Not sure what the spring selling season is going to look like this year, but from a few accounts, there are green shoots appearing. We are headed for better days, but there's a lot to wade through at the moment. So I'm just going to take our attention back to a story that was written about a week ago. Juliet, you were behind this one, and it's all around the housing bill vote being delayed despite the plea of housing advocates to just get things moving when it comes to supply, the amount of issues that we're seeing in the market at the moment, and the fact that they're coming from that lack of supply. Big story.
Yeah. Look, so that was really interesting to see because it came at a time when the Senate, Parliament is back in session. They're coming up to a point right before the winter break of saying, are we going to move forward and vote on this raft of housing packages? So that would be the Housing Australia Future Fund Bill 2023, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council Bill 2023, and the Treasury Laws Amendment, to really enable all of these key parts of the Labor government's housing initiatives. Obviously, we saw it stall a number of months ago, and it was pushed to this June deadline. So what happened leading up to, a potential vote on it was really we saw a lot of pressure from all sides, and the government came out with a huge raft of social housing funding, which Kyle will get into a little bit as well, seeing as he really covered the nitty-gritty of that. But what it spurred on was a number of housing and homelessness organizations to go, you know what? These bills, they're not perfect, but they're good enough for right now to start getting some building happening in this country, which is what we need to do. We can see that the government has made some concessions on social housing, on funding social housing. So while we intend to continue to advocate for the needs of homeless people and low-income people, advocate for their housing needs, we say, let's get on with it. Let's vote on this bill and let's push it forward. Now, that was only a couple days ago, and a lot has happened since then. So maybe, Kyle, seeing as you have really been on top of this story, what's in that $2 billion and then kind of what happened after that, why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, big week in the political world of real estate. So the government did announce over the weekend a $2 billion social housing accelerator program. What many see sort of this as a bit of a last-ditch attempt to get the Greens over the line, because one of the big things that they were pushing for is more investment in social housing. So, yeah, many believe that the Albanese government did push this out to get their support. So it's quite hefty, $2 billion. It's split down state by state based on, I guess, size and what the state needs, but the minimum that each state or territory will receive is $50 million, and that'll be dealt out to Tasmania, the Northern Territory and the ACT. New South Wales gets the most funding. They'll get $610 million. And what we heard from quite a few property players right across the board, we heard from the CEO of REWA, we spoke to people down in Victoria, Tim McKibben from the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales, and across the board, people were generally pleased by this scheme. I think most of them agree that any funding from government is good at the moment, but it still doesn't appear to be enough. I spoke to Tim McKibben on Monday, and he did a cost breakdown that if you say the average cost to build a home is $350,000, this $2 billion will probably produce, I can't remember exactly, but it was just a tick over 5,000 homes, which, at this time, anything's good. But given, national shortfall of housing is predicted to be about 100,000 over the next 5 years, it does fall a bit short of the mark. But I guess you can't really knock the federal government for trying, and beggars can't be choosers, and any money in the housing purse is good for people.
And I feel like now, supply, it really did become an election platform for the Labor government, whether they wanted it to become one or not. A lot of people did vote at the polls, and housing affordability did come into that. And because supply underpins the affordability piece, it became that platform. And we've really seen over the last couple of days, Kyle, just how much of a hard line the Greens are now taking against that.
Yeah, it's been a big week for the Greens. Obviously, they knocked back the bill, the Housing Australia Future Fund bill, and the other two. I think for the federal government, the HAF was the big one that they wanted to push through. But, the Greens stored it back, pushing the vote back to October along with the coalition. And I think obviously housing supply was a big one, was one of the big reasons that there was a bit of friction between Labor and the Greens, is the Greens wanted more guaranteed investment into social housing. The Labor government did give them that, but they also wanted the Labor government to take action on rent freezes and rent caps. That was their second big demand that they made to the government in order to get their support for the housing legislation that was stalled on Monday. But Labor last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, Julie Collins come out and pretty much said rent freezes don't work and the government aren't going to pursue them. And obviously that's been a big factor in the Greens stalling it. And as we reported yesterday, that has sort of put the threat of a double dissolution election on the cards, I guess.
It hasn't happened for a while. And for it to be coming from the government in power to say, whether or not it's an empty threat that we will go back to the polls, it does bring up that cause for alarm. And I think both sides now, even though you normally think of Labor and Greens as being kind of a combined force, both sides are pretty well sticking to their guns. So I think it's going to be an interesting period going forward. Obviously now we can't really do anything about that unlocking of supply until at least October. Who knows what will come to the table before then?
And, in fact, I think you're totally right on that, Grace. Nobody really has any idea what we're going to see going into October. Just this morning, Julie Collins has sat down in a radio interview and said pretty much that. They're not sure how or if they want to change what they put forward. She's sticking pretty firm to the idea that rental caps are not ever going to be on the table. Greens don't appear to be willing to move on that either. So, things on this are changing pretty rapidly. We may see that there's some wiggle on the part of the government, looking at initiatives that a number of different cities around the world have enacted, like an example for in Ireland, where, they have different zones where a rental freeze might come into action if housing dips below a certain vacancy rate. That seems to be all off the table for now. But it is something that people are starting to talk about, like what does a rental freeze look like if the Greens aren't willing to move? Is that something that we might find becoming more a part of the conversation?
And we're even seeing that already. I think it'll be a conversation for just after the break. But before we do get to the break, I guess just to really spell it out to people, a double dissolution is when a bill has attempted to go through the House of Representatives and then the Senate, and then the Senate has knocked it back. And then you've got to wait another 3 months basically to be able to try and put that legislation back on the table, back in front of those people. And if it fails again, it could be seen as a lack of confidence within the sitting government. And that's when you see the double dissolution kick in and the potential that Australians could end up back before the polls. And I think a lot of people don't want that at this particular point in time. it does feel like an interesting platform for this to potentially take place. Usually we've seen them for fairly different reasons rather than, a pretty bipartisan housing supply issue. So who knows where we go from here. We're going to take a quick break. See you on the other side.
Are you feeling the strain of high mortgage repayments? Refinancing with Finny Mortgages can help you save big on your home loan and ease the burden on your finances. Our team of expert brokers specialises in helping Australian investors find the best possible rates. Refinance with Finny Mortgages today and start saving. Visit finny.com.au or call us now at 028 866 2444 to chat with an expert.
Welcome back to this very special conversation. We are unpacking the current political landscape because there has been so much going on in the housing and property spheres over the last couple of weeks. It's been a lot for our team to take on, but they have handled it amazingly, and we are here to deliver you all the latest news, make sure you are as up to date as possible. And one of the latest things, Kyle, we haven't even really reported on yet, but I know you've got some intel of some Greens activity that is quite unusual.
Yeah, so it seems the Greens have sort of been prepared for the reality that Australia might head back to the polls for a little while because they've engaged in a door-knocking campaign in Labor-held electorates to sort of, I guess, prove to the Labor government that if I guess they don't meet the Greens' demands related to rental caps and the Housing Australia Future Fund and that package doesn't get passed through Parliament and we have to go back to the polls, Labor may lose seats to the Greens, and I think that's a pretty interesting one to sort of look moving forward.
It's an interesting stance to take, and it does feel very much like grassroots campaigning, but it is a funny one because, you had mentioned to us, Kyle, that it seems to be more about the campaign rather than the substance.
That's what Albo said yesterday, yeah. Albo said that yesterday. So
the Labor Party is very well aware of what the Greens are trying to do, whether it's an intimidation tactic. It does feel like a very funny thing to be doing, again, on what is a pretty... there's very broad support for the housing package that has been put forward by the Labor Party and the sitting government. So, for the Greens to be kind of going rogue on this area feels a little bit like, I don't know. I mean, it could kick them in the bum. Who knows? It might be the most ingenious thing we've ever seen. Time will tell. We'll have to wait and see. Interestingly, though, if we do take it to a state-based political level, we are seeing some movement in Victoria, and it looks like the sitting Dan Andrews government is willing to work with the Greens on potentially bringing in rent caps or rent freezes.
Yeah, it's very funny. A letter sent by Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas to the Victorian Greens stipulated, I'd probably preface this first by saying that the Victorian government is looking to introduce tax reforms in their next state budget, and in order for that to pass through Parliament, they need the Greens' support. And so in an attempt, I guess, to get that support and make sure that those tax reforms become ratified, the Treasurer, Tim Pallas, wrote to the Victorian Greens and amongst other things, he outlined that a new housing task force would be looking at the possibility of introducing rent caps in the state.
And we saw at the federal level that this got shut down, and that I can understand Julie Collins' perspective there. It's not a federal issue for them to be bringing in anything of the sort. They don't have the jurisdiction to be able to enact something like that. On a state-based level, it's a different story. So, there'll obviously be some conversations happening over the next couple of weeks. We will bring you all the very latest as we hear it. Kyle did get to see that letter that was sent from the Treasurer to the Greens, even though the Treasurer didn't want you to see it, did he?
Yeah, no, they said we will not be sharing that letter with you, but thankfully the Greens did.
So, I mean, campaigning in itself. So it is one of those things that it maybe at a state-based level there is some function there, and maybe if it does get up on that state level, that might be enough for the Greens at a federal level to fall into line and accept the Housing Australia Future Fund as it is. So there's a lot of money currently being tabled, and a lot of it has been, set aside for the purpose of easing some of these issues around the housing crisis, especially when it comes to supply, acknowledging that it is a very long-term issue and something needs to happen now. And I think that's the point that a lot of people are at right now. Just what can we do right now to actually, make the future a little bit easier for people who are trying to get into the market. So I always say it, but another one where we very much will be watching this space and going from here. Juliet, what are some of the commentary you've seen more broadly than just Victoria? Because it has sort of instigated, we've seen conversations around the potential for rent caps or rent freezes Australia-wide. We've seen a lot of pushback against that idea too. Where do you think, some of the states and territories might be standing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because, look, let's not forget that somewhere like Canberra, the ACT, they do actually have already caps in place to limit the amount that rent can be increased. So while when they first brought it in, they limited it to 20% of an increase, they've now dropped it down, or not too long ago, dropped it down to 10%. And as we know, I mean, even long before the very tight rental markets that we've seen across the country, Canberra itself was one that was often struggling with its rental vacancy rates. And a lot of economists do put that down to some of the laws restricting rental increases in that territory because it kind of ties the hands of investors in some ways. So people have sort of been looking at those policies and talking about the positives and negatives. Should we start to see something like that? And, opinions are pretty broadly split. I mean, there would be, not to put too fine a point on it, there would be negatives. There would be economic negatives to enacting something like a rental freeze or to starting to limit that. We know that people will drop out of the market at the same time faced with, these rents that just seem to be skyrocketing. A lot of people are also saying, well, but, should we at this point not say that anything is off the table? And rather than looking at, rental freeze does also, I think, have some connotations to it, like your hands are tied and you can't lift the rent at all for any period of time. I think more likely in practice, not saying that it would come in, but what places are likely to start looking at are this kind of thing, like in Canberra or like we mentioned, in Ireland, where they have potential, rings of rental vacancy where you might start to tamp down on the amount that a landlord can raise the rent if vacancy rates tighten to a certain extent. So, it's an interesting conversation. There are a lot of sides to it, and we're just here sort of reporting on it and can see that, people care a lot about this, understandably, because it comes back to the concept of home and being able to afford your home.
I mean, even Queensland coming out with the decision to, cap rent raises to once a year. Mm-hmm. And that saw a lot of uproar at the time, but you kind of go, well, yeah, in this environment of vacancy rates being below 1%, something has to give sometimes. So I guess it's a conversation that is sort of playing out as well across South Australia and Western Australia. In New South Wales, we've seen skyrocketing rents across Sydney over the last 3 months in particular. So there might be a measure that needs to come in to rein some of that back in. But I think as well, while we keep seeing the Reserve Bank raise rates, you can't help but be looking to those other ways of doing things. So we're going to take another break there. We'll be back in just a moment to discuss more of the current property landscape. See you in a bit.
Are you on the lookout for your next investment property? Smart Property Investment and Pure Property Investment have done the research for you on where the hottest up-and-coming suburbs for 2024 are and where you should invest for the best return. The report is completely free to download. Visit smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Don't make any moves until you've read the report. Take your next step with all the facts, backed by research and industry experts.
Welcome back to this very special conversation. We've been unpacking the current political landscape at play in the property market across Australia, and we'll keep delivering you the updates and the news as we get it, because it's obviously, the situation is changing day to day. Obviously, that doesn't have an immediate effect on the property market necessarily, but more long term, it's very much going to have an impact. And one thing that has been having an impact all year, for the last 12 months really, is the Reserve Bank of Australia and the lifting of rates much earlier than anyone had anticipated. We saw in June the rate raise again. We're now above 4%. The banks, big four banks, economists are all predicting that we probably still have another 1 or 2 rate rises within us. That in itself has been having a huge impact on rents. We've seen people, that have a mortgage to pay having to lift their rents, wanting to lift their rents to keep up with what is happening with the Reserve Bank of Australia. And inflation is obviously still an issue that is trying to be reined in by Dr. Philip Lowe and the Reserve Bank of Australia Board of Directors. So where do you two think it could be going from here? Do you think we've got another couple of rate rises within us?
I do, Grace. I think that, the RBA is really sticking to their guns of, they're not considering impact on house prices. They are really just only targeting inflation. And that while a number of things are happening due to those rate rises, including mortgages that are just going up and up and up, they seem to be pretty firm in their stance on this. It's an interesting question that you bring up, because I think that the role of the RBA in house prices has been something that we've been looking at. Obviously, all the commentary always comes back to, how will this impact buyers? How will this impact mortgage holders? But we saw some really interesting commentary come out of the Australian Housing and Urban that were looking at really what needs to happen in Australia to kind of combat this supply issue. And they, this is sort of an aside, they looked at the need to really have like a single entity driving that policy. But in looking at that, they also talked about how the RBA and APRA to a certain extent as well, with the policies that they're making, are almost directing their own housing policy from these sort of independent boards. And they talked about that as something that needs to be addressed in future as they make these decisions, RBA with their cash rate calls, APRA with the loan serviceability buffer, and how that really, it comes down, it has an impact on what's happening on the market. And that though they need to be independent, of course, there also needs to be some level of communication potentially between a single unifying housing entity to discuss, what will happen if we continue on a trajectory like, for example, we are on at this present time.
Yeah, it's one of those things too, the argument keeps being made that the RBA only has that one lever to pull. So of course they're going to pull it. And no matter how narrow their scope is, there is a knock-on effect. There's a domino effect from that. And given how closely linked mortgages are to the Reserve Bank of Australia's decision-making, you can see why that is very much an issue. So it will be interesting whether they lift rates again straight away in July, beginning of a new financial year, or whether they hold for a little bit. We've seen commentary that we are nearing that terminal rate. While we might not be there yet, we are probably getting to the end, and hopefully that can bring some reprieve to a lot of people. And even still, the property market is still forging ahead, Kyle. So many auctions still happening in what is traditionally a very dead period for the real estate market.
That's right. You'd think the weather was 30 degrees outside and the sun's shining, the birds are chirping, because auction activity has not really slowed down. This week it's down about 5%, but it's still at 1,800 or so across the country. Yeah, to the point where, CoreLogic pretty much every week has included a line that this auction activity defies seasonal expectations. And not only that, it's not as if more homes are going, up for auction and they're not getting sold. Clearance rates have also been, quite high up. So much so that auction clearance rates have sort of, they've flirted above 70% for, nearly 2 months now. I think Sydney's dipped to 69.5% last week, and that was their lowest in 7 weeks. So yeah, it's been, I guess, a good time to throw your house under the hammer.
I was talking to an auctioneer this morning and I put it to him. We've recently seen Domain come out with a forecast for more record price highs on the horizon over the next financial year. And I said, do you think this will actually be the case? And he said, I don't think we'll be at that extent, but I can see why there is that optimism there. He said that the lack of supply that's still filtering through from needs to come onto the market at some point. It's not just going to disappear. It's not going to not go anywhere. So he is also expecting, probably even more of a lift through spring, through summer. And then we might have a bit more clarity about what's going on with the Reserve Bank of Australia by then. Rates may have started to go down, or if not, have just held. We seem to see that every time rates hold, there is confidence coming back in. Buyers are ready to pounce. So again, it's going to have to be a watch this space kind of thing to see what happens. But I think there is still plenty of optimism ahead for the property market. Juliet, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Grace. Always a pleasure.
Kyle, you too. Good to have you in the studio.
Thank you, Grace.
To everyone listening at home, we hope you have enjoyed this episode. Make sure you like or review us on whatever platform that you do listen to your podcasts on. If you do have any questions, the email address to reach out to is editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Otherwise, stay up to date with all the latest news on our website. Subscribe for our daily bulletins if you haven't already, and check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn and Instagram. Until next episode, stay safe and well wherever you're listening from. Bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.